6 minutes into her final match as a professional soccer player, Megan Rapinoe tore her Achilles. And afterwards, she had this to say: "I'm not a religious person or anything, and if there was a God, like this is proof there isn't." Now, you may be familiar with her. She's been around for a long time and is known for being relatively outspoken about some of the things that she believes. So a person like her gets a lot of publicity for what she says. But she is definitely not alone. Lots and lots of people have reached similar conclusions about God, based on what they believe to be some inequity or some injustice. For instance, here's a man by the name of Bart Ehrman. He's actually a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina. And he says this: "The God I once believed in was a God who is active in the world. He saved Israelites from slavery. He sent Jesus for the salvation of the world. He answered prayer. He intervened on behalf of His people when they were in desperate need. He was actively involved in my life, but I can't believe in that God anymore because from what I now see around the world, He doesn't intervene." Now, to be fair, this is not where his disbelief started, but it is clear this concept of God not doing enough is troubling to him. But this is not just stuff that's happening with celebrities or athletes or college professors. Lots of people have real questions about the evil that they see in this world and how God and evil coexist. And how can you explain evil? How can you explain suffering? How can you explain all the stuff that goes wrong if there is a God? As a matter of fact, in a Barna survey last year, the three things that were near the top of the list, the question was, top things that cause people to doubt Christian beliefs. That's what they were trying to get to the bottom of. What are the top things that cause people to doubt Christian beliefs? And here are three of those top things: human suffering, unanswered questions, and conflict in the world. Those are the things that rack the minds of people and cast doubt about Christianity because there are these unfortunate things that happen in the world. And so I want to work with some of that this afternoon. And when we work through some of that, we'll be done. And maybe you're saying, thank goodness. You have been incredible listeners. It was mentioned a couple of times. This is a rather intense meeting because we get here on Saturday afternoon, then back Saturday night, and then 3 times back to back. You're owed something for listening to me that many times back to back to back. So I appreciate it. Many of you have been here every time. Most of you, all of you, I'm sure, have been here when you can. And I appreciate that. So many of you have contributed to feeding me in some way. That's the way to my heart. If you feed me well, I'm inclined to come back even if you don't ask me to. So I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate the Gwens who put up with me. They let me sleep in their barn last night, which was very nice of them. So I'm appreciative of that, and more than that, more than the good food and getting to spend time with you guys, you've said some really nice things. And listen, you never hurt my feelings if you say nice things about me. But more than just saying nice things, you have said that some of the stuff you've heard has been helpful to you. And if I had any goal other than that, I don't know why I would. That's all I wanted to be able to do, is share some stuff with you that would be helpful as you go through this life. This is a hard life. This is tough in a lot of ways. This is not easy stuff. It's not an easy world to live in, and it's definitely not an easy world to navigate if you're trying to walk God's way through this life. And so I commend you for the efforts that you're making. You do have lots of young people here. You've got lots of young families here. And I think that's just an incredible thing to see, that parents are bringing up their children to know the Lord. And I'm thankful to see all of that. And I'm glad that I got to come be a part of that, even if it was for a short period of time. Let me warn you up front, we are going to close with a lot that I'm going to put on your plate. I don't expect that you'll remember all the details of every argument. I don't expect that I'll exhaust all the arguments even now. But I'm telling you a lot because what I really want you to see is when it comes to these attacks on God, when you have people who are observing bad things happening and they're using that to attack the character of God, or they're even using that kind of stuff to say that God doesn't even exist at all. What I want you to know is when you see these attacks on God, or maybe some doubts come into your own mind. I want you to know there is absolutely no shortage of answers. So don't let some celebrity, don't let some famous athlete, don't let some professor, don't let something you see on YouTube shatter your faith. And I want to say one more thing specifically to young people. I think this is important to say. If you have doubts, that does not mean something is wrong with you. If you have questions, that does not mean that there is something wrong with you. There's no shame in having questions. All of us have to wrestle with difficult things. And oftentimes that's just part of the process of growing up and making your faith your own. So you younger people out there, I want you to hear that. If you have some questions about some of the stuff that you're hearing or seeing, that doesn't have to scare you. It doesn't have to shatter your faith. You're not wrong for having those questions. And so I just challenge you to seek the answers in the right places. But let's start here. I want to start here. When someone concludes that God must not exist because of evil, there is a problem with that conclusion, and the problem is that evil cannot exist without God. The very fact that we know certain things are right and certain things are wrong says there is a God, and here's why. For there to be objective right or wrong, there has to be a standard that's higher than our own. If you were here earlier today, we talked some about this, about the absurdity in the world, because the world is trying to operate with no standard. The world is trying to operate with this relative truth where what you say is true, what I say is true. It doesn't matter if those things are opposed to each other or not. But for us to truly know that something is right or something is wrong, for us to be able to say that, there has to be a standard higher than our own. And that standard is God's standard. And so I need you to see that when somebody is saying that evil means God must not exist, They're saying something that could only exist if there is a God, because the standard that we're recognizing to say something is good or evil could only come from God. So, I had a piece of paper, I forgot to bring it up here, so I'll just challenge you with this visual. But this piece of paper just had a really crooked line on it. And I really wanted to test you. I wanted to show that to you, and you tell me, is that line straight or is that line crooked? And it's a pretty easy test. It is very clear that that line is crooked. But how do you know the line is crooked? How would you know? What basis would you say that the line that I drew on that was crooked? The very fact that we know there's a standard. The very fact that a straight line exists is what allows us to know that a line is crooked. And the same thing is true when it comes to morals. If there is not an objective standard, there's no basis for calling anything evil. Good and evil are just opinions. So if on my way home back to Alabama this afternoon, if I see a man stranded on the side of the road and I stop and I help him, whatever that is, I help him get his car going, I let him use my phone or whatever. If I help him get back going to where he's going, you know what I've just done? I've done something good, haven't I? You would say that is good. But if I took that opportunity to club him over the head with something and take his money, you would say that's bad. I'm not going to do that, by the way. But everybody would look at that and say, you stopped and helped this man, that's good, or you robbed this man, and that is bad. But the very fact that we know certain things are right or wrong suggests there is a God. And so I start there because I need you to be very aware that the very thing people use to argue against God makes the case for God. Saying that evil exists says there is a God, else we would know the difference between good and evil. Here's a second thing I want you to think about, and that is that free will can't exist without evil. Some people have pondered, we live in this world and there are all these imperfections and this goes wrong and this goes wrong, and well, why couldn't God, or why wouldn't God, if God is all powerful, if God can do everything that you say He can do, then why would God not just stop all the evil? Why would God not just make this a perfect world? That sounds like a good question. And there's something that sounds kind of appealing about that, right? I live in a world where nobody's going to do me wrong, and I'm not ever going to have an injury. I like to play basketball, and I'd like a good guarantee that as I get older and keep trying to play, I'm not going to blow out a knee or twist an ankle. It kind of has an appeal to it, right? To think, so why could God not create that? Why could not God give us a world where there are no diseases, or where there's no injuries, or there's no evil, no people doing bad? I will suggest He gave that world in the beginning. But Genesis 3 gives us some explanation as to why the world is no longer like that. But I want to go a little bit deeper than that. Because I would suggest that God could keep a perfect world, but in order for God to keep a perfect world, God would have to make every choice for every man every time. Think about that. For this world to be a perfect place, because that's what some people say. Why not, God? Why not just make the world perfect? Okay, if God made the world perfect, He then has to take away your free will. Because once you give man a choice, they are free to do whatever it is they want to do, even if that choice hurts them or it hurts somebody else. If God did not give us a choice, do you know what we would be? If He didn't give us a choice, all we'd really be are robots, just programmed to do whatever it is we're supposed to do. And we would only ever do what He programmed us to do, and we would never do anything other than what He programmed us to do. So if that's true, now love could not exist. Because you can't have love without free will. Do y'all see how this works? You want a perfect world, but a perfect world would demand taking away choice. And if you take away choice, now love can't exist. So what originally sounded pretty good, yeah, let me live in that perfect world where I don't ever have to worry about bad things happening. But if I give you that world, I can't. You have the choice to do anything. And oh, by the way, that little thing called love, that wouldn't exist. Because robots don't have the ability to love. There's a lot of technology in this world. I know there's some robotic technology. Many of you may have it in your homes, that little robot vacuum cleaner. It doesn't love you. I mean, we could go better than that. We could have a robot move in with us, and we could program it to tell us the nicest things, and it would only ever do what we wanted it to do, and it would never do anything that we didn't want it to do. And that robot could move into our house, but you know what? We would never, ever, ever think the robot loves me. Why? It's only doing what it's programmed to do. It doesn't have a choice to do anything else. And so that's where we are with God. God wants us to choose Him. But He didn't program us to do that. He doesn't force us to do that. He gave us the capacity to love. He gave us the capacity to choose. And because men have the ability to love and they have the ability to choose, bad things will happen. And once you establish that bad things can happen because of free will, that really just starts explaining every possible thing you can imagine. So whether we're talking about some fault with creation, we could go all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, and there's some explanation as to why nature does what it does. Or maybe we're just thinking about the damage that sin does. Maybe we can think about self-inflicted damage. Have anybody ever done that before, where you're suffering because of some mistake that you made? I've been there plenty of times. I get there more often than I want to, but I have found myself suffering. Why? Because I made a mistake. And I've also been on this side of it before, and you have too, where we suffer. It's not because of my own wrongdoing. It's because somebody else made a choice to do something bad. We could put some Bible stories with that. Just one, for instance. Think about David and his sin with Bathsheba. There was definitely some self-inflicted pain on David's part, right? He suffered a lot, but it was because of his own wrongdoing. But David's suffering did not stop with him. As a matter of fact, if we were to just sit down and try to write down all of the bad things that happened, all of the people that suffered because of that moment where David decided, I want that woman, bring her to me. If we were to try to write down, I don't know that we could do it all. Do you see now why free will is the cause of evil? That's the explanation. We could go on and on and on. But evil, bad, suffering, it's a result of sin, and the sin is a result of free will. And so I need you to see that, because God gave you the capacity to love, because God gave you the capacity to make choices. With that ability comes suffering. So know that. Suffering does not prove that there is not a God. It says something about the way that God made us. And it says something about the nature of this life. And speaking of the nature of this life, to really understand evil, we have to be able to understand what God's ultimate purposes are. Or maybe we could say it this way: it requires us to see the big picture. So think about this for a minute. I want you to just recognize and acknowledge, and you'll be able to do this pretty quickly. But I want you to recognize that the Bible never tries to hide the imperfections of life. The Bible is not trying to cover up the fact that evil exists. The Bible is never trying to hide that from us. It's not running from us. As a matter of fact, all it really does is acknowledges that it happens, and then it gives us some way to process all of that. As a matter of fact, last night we studied from Psalm 1, also from Psalm 37, and Psalm 37 acknowledges what? There's evil doing and there's suffering sometimes because of that. I just need you to see that. From the very beginning all the way through the end, what is the Bible acknowledging? It's not trying to deceive us. It's not trying to hide anything. The Bible is very open that pain and suffering are real. And so we need to be able to see that. So if you're interpreting bad things to mean there is no God, what that really means is there's just a failure to see the big picture. Now, if God had promised perfection, we'd have a case against Him, wouldn't we? If I could find somewhere in my Bible where God promised that the life here would be free of strife, it would be free of peril, it would be free of suffering, if I could find those promises somewhere and then evil did actually happen, then I would have a case against God. But because there are no such promises, I don't have a case against God. As a matter of fact, the only promise that God made related to perfection is not in this life, but it is in the life to come. So I want you turning in your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3. There's a lot here in 2 Peter chapter 3 that would be appropriate to talk about when we're thinking about the world and how people view the world and people who are skeptical. You remember kind of towards the beginning of the chapter, Peter's addressing skeptics. People are mockers, he says in chapter 3 and verse 3. In the last days, mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lust, saying, where's the promise of His coming? Here are people who are, I think, questioning at least the integrity of God, maybe the existence of God altogether, because their observance is telling them all of this stuff we've been hearing may not be true. Because if God were real, if God were able to make good on these promises that He's made, then things would be different than what they are. But Peter says, or verse 4 is there, where's the promise of His coming? Ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. And then Peter goes on to explain, it's not that God is not going to make good on His promises. And oh, by the way, it's not as if He doesn't have the ability to do what He says He's going to do. And so He reminds them that God is going to fulfill promises. He reminds them of these events that proves that God has the ability to do what He says He's going to do. But then He goes on to explain. The very fact that God has not come back yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It really means it's an opportunity for salvation. You still have an opportunity there. But I want you to see this in verse 13. But according to His promise, the promise of God, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. There is a place, there is a time where evil will no longer exist. It's in a new place where righteousness dwells. And so if we're trying to figure out the promises of God, if we're trying to figure out where those promises of perfection are, they exist, but they don't exist for this life. They exist for the life to come. We need to be able to see that. That's the bigger picture. We need to be able to see there's more to my existence than just this earthly life. And that's the real problem with the atheist, is because they have limited our life, they have limited our existence rather, to this life only. Now, if you are believing in the theory of evolution, then you don't really have much choice. Nothing about evolution would make you think there is an afterlife. Nothing about the process of evolution would make you think there's an eternal life to come. So if you are an atheist, you have a very small window to be able to think about things. You have a very small window in which you can process things. Do you see that? That's where they're going to hit a wall. Because they don't have an ability to see a bigger picture. They can only see what happens under the sun. And that leaves them really no way to process suffering and evil. And I get it. If this life is literally all there is, every tragedy is that much greater, right? How often have we gone to a funeral, especially a funeral of someone who is what we would consider way too young to die? And while we're sad for the loss and we're hurt because of what's happened, what do we say? What do? We comfort one another with these words, right? We start reading Paul and what he said to the Thessalonians, and there's coming a day when all of this is going to go away, and there's going to be that new place where Jesus comes again. You see, we have the ability to see the bigger picture, and because we can see the bigger picture, that allows us to process suffering and bad things in a totally different way. We see it in a whole new light. So, think about Jesus. We talked about that a little bit this morning. Jesus is making hard demands, isn't he? Jesus says, if you want to be able to follow Him, you have to be willing to lose this life. Now, why would I be willing to lose this life? What would cause me to give up this life? Meaning, why would I give up all the stuff that I might enjoy? Why would I not just get to do everything I want to do? Why not just be like everybody else? Why not do whatever makes me happy? Why would I not do any of that? It's because Jesus is telling us there's another life to come. And the key to that life is to lose this life. You and I are willing to lose this life. Why? Because we know there's another life to come. And getting to enjoy all the stuff in this life is not worth getting to do if it costs me eternal life. That's what Jesus is saying. If you got the whole world, it wouldn't be worth it if it cost you the life to come. And so you and I understand evil because we understand the nature of this life. We understand the concept of this life is not all that there is. I think about what James says in James chapter 1, where he says, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you endure various trials." Well, now, if this life is all there is, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it? Count it all joy when you suffer through evil things? If this is all there is, then that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it makes total sense when you recognize what James is saying. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And you know what that endurance eventually leads to? The endurance that leads to life. And so I want you to see that. When people are thinking, well, if God existed, a tragedy wouldn't happen. Well, first of all, that's not true just based on our free will. But it's also not true because that's not the scope of everything. So I will tell you, we won't always have perfect answers as to why certain things happen. I think all of us deal with that. I think all of us are going to have those moments in life. We're going to have those things that happen in our life or the life of someone close to us, and we're going to wonder why. And we're going to be left without specific answers. But what we do know is suffering does not mean that there is no God. So let me give you one more. And this is the answer that is probably the most unsatisfactory. We don't know what God knows. And I say that's unsatisfactory because in some ways it seems like a cop-out answer. You know? Well, why does this happen? I don't know, I'm not God. Well, what about this? I don't know, I'm not God. While it might come across as kind of the cop-out answer, it's the reality that we have to accept. Just because you can't see a good reason why God might allow something to happen doesn't mean there can't be one. And the sooner that we recognize that, the easier it is for us to process all the stuff that happens in life. You know, I think about that sometimes when we're thinking about our prayer life. How many times have we wondered, why did that prayer not get answered the way that I wanted it answered? Why did it not happen the way that I asked God to happen? I mean, because I'm thoroughly convinced that's what needs to happen. I am thoroughly convinced that this is the best thing, and then it didn't happen. And then you know what almost always happens? At some point later down the road, you think back and you're like, man, I'm glad that God did not answer that prayer the way that I asked Him to. Because the way this turned out ended up being way better. We're not God. And because we're not God, we'll never know everything that God knows. Just because we can't see a good reason why something might happen doesn't mean there's not one. I think we understand this pretty easily if you're a parent. You know how this works. Because as parents, we answer things, we make rules, we set boundaries, and we set limitations based on what? Based on our knowledge, based on our wisdom, based on our experience. Let me get on your good side here, parents. Kids, listen up. When your moms and dads are telling you no, it's probably not just because they're going to be mean and ruin your life. They know more than you do. Okay? They know more than you do. And so when they're saying no to this, when they're placing this limit, this boundary, when they're saying no, not now, or no, not at all, they're doing that from a place of knowledge and understanding that you just don't have. I've got a 3-year-old that I doubt would understand the concept of not riding her bike in the street. But I have a full concept of why it's not a good idea for her to ride her bike in the street. Do you see that? When we're allowing things to happen, when we're not allowing things to happen, it's coming from a place of knowledge. Now, on an astronomical scale, that's how we are with God. Why is God allowing this to happen? Why is God not stopping this? Why is God not changing this? I don't know. But just because I don't know doesn't mean there's not a good reason for it. And sometimes that's just the faith that we have to lean into really hard. And now somebody will call me out on that and say, well, you're just gullible and you're just having to rely on your faith. I will tell you, there is not a soul in this world who's not relying on faith in some capacity. If you don't believe there's a God, you're putting an awful lot of faith in a theory that has lots and lots and lots of holes in it. There's not an atheist in this world that is not trusting something they have not seen. It's not a cop-out answer to say sometimes we just have to lean on our faith. It is not a cop-out answer to say I don't always know God's plans, I don't know His purposes, I don't know His intentions. But I think we see that the best when we just acknowledge our limitations. And what I mean by that is I have some knowledge of the past. I mean, I've got my own experience in my own life, so I can remember a lot of that. And for the stuff that happened before me, I've got some history that's been recorded, so I can go back quite a ways and I can know a lot about what's happened in the past. But what do you think I know about what's going to happen in the future? Which one of you knows a lot about the future? Now, we have our future plans. I know what I plan on doing tomorrow. I know what I plan on doing when I leave here. We know our plans, but we don't really know what lies on the other side of the doors. So how would we ever be in the best position to know what's best for the future when we don't even know what the future holds? God knows. And so we can't choose to come to bad conclusions about God or the character of God or even the existence of God just because some things are happening that we don't understand. If we knew what God knew, I think we'd always be glad for the answer that we got. So, if you're looking around and seeing evil in the world and you are assuming that means there's no God, that's overlooking a lot of things. But I want you to see one more thing as we wrap this up. Sometimes people make this accusation that all this evil and suffering is happening and God just does not care. Can I tell you that's just bad wrong? That passage that was read from Hebrews, you remember what that said about Jesus? I know that God cares about suffering because He sent Jesus into the world to suffer on my behalf. That's how I know God does care about suffering. God took on suffering for Himself. Jesus Himself gave up the perks of heaven. You remember Paul saying that in Philippians chapter 2? The equality with God was not a thing to be grasped, but He emptied Himself. Jesus poured Himself out so that He could come and suffer. And do you know why He suffered? He suffered so that you and I don't have to suffer. Not now, but in eternity. God's very aware of evil and suffering. And God cares a lot about it. And God does care a lot about saving me from evil and suffering. And He's proven it through His Son, Jesus Christ. The Hebrew writer tells us that Jesus took on flesh and He endured suffering for that sole purpose, that He could render Satan powerless. That's the one who's ultimately responsible for evil and suffering, is it's Satan. And Jesus came and suffered to render him powerless. And so because of that, I don't have to live in fear. There may be some terrible things that happen to me in this life, but one thing that I don't have to worry about is living in fear. There may be some things that I don't understand. There are going to be some things that I don't like, but I don't have to live in fear. It's because God cares about suffering. And God will bring all suffering to an end one day for all the righteous. So, are you aligned with God? We read from 2 Peter about a time coming in a place where only righteousness dwells. And if that time of judgment were right now, is that where you'd go? That's only for people who have made themselves right with God. And so I'm going to challenge you to think very seriously and very soberly right now about where you are with God. Are you right with God? Have you made your life all about Him? Have you made Jesus the Lord of your life? Have you sought the forgiveness from God through Jesus, through the baptism of your sins? Have you done that? And have you done your best to follow Him every step of the way? Maybe you have. And if you have, that's good news. There's a lot of hope that we have to hold on to. Maybe you've done that before, but you've messed all of that up. I think one more time about what Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 3. God is patient, not willing that any should perish, but that all come to repentance. Is there somebody here this afternoon that needs to save their soul from death and come to God in repentance? If that describes you, I hope you'll do it now. Let's stand and sing.